So this is more conceptual work at this stage. I'm really hoping to start more empirical work on this particular topic soon, but at this point it's particularly conceptual work that is also informed by a book I edited with Jacqueline Baxter, where we talked about the relation between trust, accountability, and capacity in education system reform. And the book has chapters from various countries and colleagues from other countries in the world who use our framework to look at education system reform more widely. But when we started with presenting that framework and discussing it with colleagues, obviously I also started thinking about some of the issues around trust, capacity, and accountability in the Dutch context. And one of the issues that is really relevant to think about in the Dutch context is that we have a country that is really high on, or scoring really high in terms of generalized trust in international surveys. It's also scoring quite high on trust in the education system. And yet we do find over the years in inspection annual reports that we have quite high homogeneous schools, schools that are very similar in terms of the student population due to school parents and students self-selecting into these schools. So this is kind of the problem statement I want to start this presentation with, and explore some of this context for issues around trust between students, their generalized trust, and how we can explain this particular phenomenon. But let me start by looking at those measures of trust. First of all, generalized trust, which is really a question around do you trust unknown others, or do you, for your country, feel that most people can be trusted? And this is a question that is being asked in quite a number of international surveys, such as the World Values Survey, the Edelman Barometer, and the OECD is also reporting on this particular measure of generalized trust over a number of years. And what you see is if you compare this to other Western countries, that the Netherlands is scoring quite high in this regard and has also seen, at least between 2007 and 2014, an increase in generalized trust. Another way to think about trust is interpersonal trust. And this is a question that is quite related to generalized trust, talking about or asking people about, would you say that most people can be trusted? And here they present a scale from 0 to 10, where 10 is quite high trust. And looking at this map of Europe, you can again see that the Netherlands is scoring quite high in this regard. Not as high as some of the Scandinavian countries, but definitely much higher than, for example, France. So again, using this data from Eurostat, European Values Survey, we are scoring quite high. But obviously, this is a very generic question. That's also some of the criticism around these type of surveys. There is not really a context to talk about trust, but it's kind of talking about an attitude towards trust. So a more specific question would be looking at trust of others in your own neighborhood. Asking the question about how much do you trust people in your neighborhood. And again, here also the Netherlands is scoring quite high. So we seem to be a very trusting country, which then begs the question, if that's the case, why do we in primary education send our children to schools that have a very similar population in terms of background as to our own? Why is that if we feel that we can trust everyone? So that leads us to kind of look at whether people trust the education system. Do people in general have a high trust in the education system compared to other countries? And this is also something that's measured, and it's measured in the Gallup World Poll. And the data I'm presenting here are from the Gallup World Poll that was administered in 2020. But it was reported in the Government at a Glance OECD report in 2021. And here again, I've kind of indicated with an arrow where the Netherlands is scoring compared to the OECD average, and we're quite on the left, which indicates that we're among the countries scoring highest in terms of how citizens trust the education system and schools. So again, here we find quite high levels of trust in this particular education system. So again, that leads us to question, why do we then see such high segregation in our education system? And talking a little bit more about that high level of segregation, it's something that's reported by the Dutch Inspectorate of Education, who is using analysis by Willem Boterman, who's looked at various cities in the Netherlands and tried to explain the level of segregation according or because of the neighborhood that people live in, as well as active school segregation, whereby parents send their child out to a school outside of their own neighborhood. And what you see on this figure is the level of segregation due to where people live. That is the light blue color. And the dark blue color is really an active self-segregation where parents are sending their children to schools outside of their own neighborhood. And this is for primary education, measured in 2016. So you see variation across cities, but particularly Dordrecht, for example, Enschede, you see quite high active segregation where parents are sending their child to a primary school outside of their own neighborhood. So that leads us to think about how can we not only explain that, but also what are the consequences of such high levels of segregation for development of trust? I mean, we can expect that questions of issues or around trust are a cause of that high level of segregation, but we are also interested to think about the consequences of such high levels of segregation for the development of trust. And here we are really drawing on the work of Alpert, Putnam, and a review by Pettigrew and Trop in 2006, which talk about or which present kind of three theoretical perspectives around how trust is or isn't developing in a diverse context. So they really look at whether contact between people from different ethnic groups, particularly how that contact leads to development of trust between groups who are different in terms of their background. And in that theoretical framework, we find three different perspectives. The first one is a perspective of contact theory, which really posits that The more contact you have with people from other social groups in terms of their culture, language, beliefs, skin color, nationality, etc., would lead to improved intergroup relations and trust, where people are more willing to deal with each other as equals. And what they argue is that the more contact, particularly under certain conditions, such as having equal status, having deep relations over time, would reduce negative stereotypes, would reduce mutual antipathies, where the distinction between feeling part of an in and out group is reduced, and solidarity between groups increases. So the premise, underlying premise of contact theory is that the more exposure and deep contact would actually lead to improved trust between different social groups. The second perspective is one of conflict, which is kind of the opposite of what contact theory predicts. And here research actually finds quite a lot of evidence to say that contact between different in and out groups actually reduces trust, that a more diverse context actually leads to reduced trust, where people really stick to their own and become less trustful of others. Where minority groups, for example, kind of develop a more distrusting attitude towards people that they would perceive to be in an other group, and where you get kind of cliques according to ethnic or other type of background features, with high levels of in-group trust, but not so much trust towards people you consider to be part of an other group. And then the third theory or third perspective was put forward by Putnam in his 2017 Skid Prize lecture. Many of you will know his famous book about bowling alone, where he actually says that both perspectives are not valid. Where he actually says that in a high diverse context, people don't develop either in or out group trust. They don't develop any of that trust. They don't develop either in group or out group trust. Rather, they tend to hunker down, is what he calls this. They retreat within their own inner circle, own family life. He compares it to being a turtle. People refrain from any contact with either people they consider to be part of their in-group as well as their out-group. So construct theory really predicts that in a diverse context, people just don't interact with anyone at all. So that's quite a depressing perspective that he presents there. And he calls that bowling alone, which is really a kind of visual image that you see on this slide as well. But across those three perspectives, there is kind of a common red line which says that the type of contact does really matter in whether a diverse context and contact between people from different backgrounds and groups actually reduces prejudice and leads to the development of trust. So the actual context really matters in which type of perspective holds true or becomes valuable. The first type of saying that whether you actually have positive or negative contact with others is relevant here, whether the contact is superficial or deep. And here they really talk about how friendships and that type of relationship is needed between different groups to build trust over time. Another relevant element is whether the contact is voluntary or enforced. whether there is a sense of equal status between groups, particularly if you have minority or majority groups, whether they feel they have equal status in a particular context, and also where they feel they have a shared goal in common. And an example that's often given there in a school context is if you have a sport activity or some other type of extracurricular activity that can really create a type of shared goal that would create trust between different social groups. So under these conditions, we see that contact actually does lead to more trust over time. It increases empathy, reduces potential feelings of threat and uncertainty. But this research has particularly been done in kind of neighborhood contexts and workplace environments, and not so much in an education context. And why it's relevant to look at or to do this type of research in an education context is that children are very young when they go to school, and we know that they're still developing their identity when in school and when at that age. And identity development is a really relevant element to stereotyping, to the development of trust, which is why the school context is so relevant to kind of develop that context for high trust. We can think about the type of extracurricular activities that are relevant to allow groups to have meaningful context, but also the role modeling and background of teachers will be an important element in how students from different groups develop trust in one another, and the type of instruction, cooperative learning methods or mixed learning groups will be relevant aspects there as well. So we can think about whether all of this particular context in a school system actually allows for opportunities for contact, and whether the conditions are in place for positive contact. And here is where school segregation obviously becomes relevant again, because in a highly segregated context where students are sorted into different school types and school buildings, whether that be in vocational or academic tracks, or whether there is a distinction between public and private schools, will lead to reduced opportunities for contact. But also within a school, we often see that there is little contact between students, even when they are in the same school building, when they are categorized and sorted into different instructional programs, clubs, grades, etc., etc. But also these types of categories that we tend to have in a school, and I'll talk about that a little bit more, they create a kind of classification or division of students into specific groups. They create the sense of in and out groups that distinguish students and kind of put them into two different groups and identity groups, and that will have consequences for their development of trust towards others as well. So let me talk a little bit more about that type of sorting and categorizing that we tend to find in schools and in school systems. And my work around accountability has really provided a lens also to understand that type of categorization. So here I'm sharing an example from some of my earlier work in New York City. Those of you who know the United States know that this is a high stakes test-based accountability system where test outcomes, test scores are used to rank schools, but also rank schools according to how different ethnic groups are performing. where they are reporting performance of students according to ethnicity, for example, according to whether they are English language learners or whether they are students with disabilities, as you can see on this slide. And what you see in schools is that that type of categorization enters the instructional environment. So school leaders, teachers, will use these categories to also look at performance within classes, within grades, and they set targets for specific groups to ensure that they meet targets that are being set by the state. So having this accountability framework on a kind of national level just enters the conversations that principals and teachers are having with students, the target setting that's going on in schools, and that creates a narrative in the school where students identify with a specific group, but not with another group. Another relevant category that we find in many school systems are about free school meals, particularly kind of distinguishing students with who come from a high poverty background. And this was an article that was published in the Guardian in England. I think I'm looking at the date now, I think it was when the scheme was just first introduced in 2014, that many children didn't want to take a free school meal because they felt stigmatized and felt ashamed because of being identified as coming from a high poverty background. So that also kind of indicates how some of these categories create in and out groups within a school environment. And an even more kind of nuanced way to look at this is how we actually test students. And some of these items, and this is again one from a New York City state test, are really, I mean, if you look at this item, it doesn't really flag any concerns initially, but when you then start talking about children from disadvantaged backgrounds or teachers who are teaching these children, they actually say that some students from disadvantaged backgrounds don't understand these questions because they are not familiar with the concept of having a dinner party. A dinner party is something that is particularly known to students from more affluent backgrounds. So even the types of test questions and items can disadvantage certain groups within a school and kind of create a sense of in and out groups. So sorting and categorizing of students has consequences for their access to resources, both material and social, for their identity development. It creates a social hierarchy within the school, allows or disallows contact between groups, and also who is considered being part of a minority or majority group, who is considered to be normal, abnormal, etc. And that has obvious consequences for both the development of in and out group trust, but also for generalized trust. So if we look at the first one, in and out group trust, that's described in the literature as a particular type of trust which arises from direct and repeated personal contact. So the type of categories that I talked about can reduce contact between different groups, but they also create identities and who students would feel commonality with. And they also create potential stereotypes and social hierarchies within the school. Thinking back about the earlier conditions of how contact can improve trust, such as equal status, etc. These type of categories potentially reduce the development of in and out group trust. And when we think about generalized trust, the question I started with and the international surveys, which really talk about kind of tolerance and acceptance and an attitude to trust unknown others. We can also expect that sorting and categorizing of students reduces generalized trust because it creates unequal opportunities and a sense of unfairness. And we know that that has an impact on generalized trust. We can also expect that the lack of contact between students from other ethnic backgrounds reduces their opportunities to actually learn about how to interact with others and assess risk of interacting with people from other groups. And that has a consequence for the sense of control you feel to interact with others, which also has an effect on generalized trust. And finally, kind of lacking a shared socializing experience in a school and development of a shared value framework will also reduce generalized trust in a country. So kind of coming back to that question then, because this all still doesn't explain the question that we started with initially, which is how can we explain a high level of segregation in the Netherlands, given that we have such high generalized trust and high outgroup trust? That just feels very counterintuitive with all of the literature that talks about the relation between sorting, categorizing, and the development of in-group, out-group trust and high generalized trust. Kind of my 2 points on trying to explain that kind of contradiction is that some of the measures around generalized trust are probably quite problematic. Just asking people about, do you trust unknown others, doesn't actually explain actual behavior of people, of whether they would actually trust someone they don't know, and whether you would do that highly depends on the specific context in which you would ask that question. So asking so you can really ask yourself if there is such a thing as having an attitude of just trusting someone you don't know, whether that is something that is always going to be context specific or not. And the question is not being asked in relation to a specific context. And then even if we do have kind of high generalized trust and high trust towards others, in the Dutch education context, that seems to transfer into something like peaceful coexistence, like, yes, I trust you as long as I don't have to interact with you. We can really ask ourselves what the implication of that is for kind of longer term social cohesion in society, if that is actual trust. But I'm sure that Anders will be able to speak about that and give some reflection on that as well. And we'd love to hear your views on this as well. So maybe to end my presentation with, in terms of what should we do in terms of preventing high level of school level segregation, given that we have freedom of school choice in the Netherlands. So we can't kind of oblige parents to choose a diverse school. That's kind of not an option in the Netherlands. So we really need to work with more motivational types of measures to ensure that we have more diverse schools, or that we allow students to come into contact with students from other backgrounds. And that really also starts before they go to primary school. We know that the kind of daycare centers that they go to, there's where children already develop friendships, and those friendships tend to also predict where they go to, which primary school they go to. They would often go to the same school, for example, where other children that they met there or have developed friendships with would go to. It also needs collective action, often in terms of school boards or municipality really trying to convince parents to go to diverse schools, or to have a kind of selection policy, a motivational selection policy, where parents are being nudged to kind of go to specific schools to improve the level of diversity in schools. Also very important is to have an inclusive school culture and types of instructional practice where teachers role model very inclusive behavior, prevent any type of stereotyping, and have the language that really champions more cultural and ethnic diversity. We also know that often very hyper diversity context is better accessible for parents. They find it easier or feel more confident to send their child to a very hyper diverse school rather than to a school where there is one big majority group and one small minority group. Particularly if they are part of that minority group, they tend to feel quite threatened by the majority group. And also the wider social policy is going to be really relevant here, because we know that if people are segregated by neighborhood, then that will have a big impact on what the school in that particular neighborhood will look like as well. So these are kind of some of the measures that are going to be relevant in the Netherlands. Yeah, just having it on the agenda is, I guess, a first activity that we need to look for as well, because at present we're talking quite a lot about educational inequality in terms of learning outcomes, but not so much about levels of segregation in the Dutch context.